Yeah, if I could like spend maybe an afternoon with a former missionary, who would it be? And it would be John Nevius. Now, here's a couple things I appreciate about him. One, he lived during a really hard time and he prioritized evangelism and discipleship. And one of the things we'll get into today is he was a really gracious critic. There are so many things in missions and theology that we care about and that we're passionate about, and we are concerned that they're done right in a biblical way. And he looked at some things in his time and said, hey, this isn't going right. And he proposed something better. And we have a lot to learn from this man that has contemporary application for us today.
Greetings and welcome to the Missions Podcast, the show that explores your hard questions on missions, theology, and practice to help goers think and thinkers go. I'm Alex Kochman, Director of Communications and Engagement with ABWE, joined again here by my good friend, just back from his trip to Hawaii, glowing as always, Scott W. Dunford, pastor of Western Hills Church in San Mateo, California. Was your trip to the Isles as delightful as I'm envying you and assuming that it is?
Yeah, like every year I try to get away on a retreat to do some planning and thinking and praying and kind of like think through my whole year. Usually I go to like someplace cold and hole up, and this year it was much cheaper actually to go to my friend's place in Hawaii. And so I'm sitting there just looking at this beach and the mountains, and yeah, it was almost perfect. Yeah, I don't want to say too much. I'm going to make you jealous, but there is a need there, and I'm wondering if God may be calling me to Hawaii, but no, He's not. I'm where I'm supposed to be.
Whatever, it's Lord, whatever you do, don't call me to Hawaii. Don't call me to be a millionaire.
Right? There is a lot of poverty and need and trauma and difficulty there. It's easy to look at the beautiful scenery and forget the people, and I do think God needs to raise up more people to help minister there. But anyway, it was fantastic time.
No doubt. Well, speaking of near perfection, our guest today to the show is a returning guest. And, Scott, our theme this year has really just been the fact that we stand as modern missions people on the shoulders of giants. None of us showed up here on our own, right? We're all the product of somebody else's investment, but also missions today. It didn't start with William Carey. It didn't start with Billy Graham. It started really with Christ and the apostles and continued throughout history. We've spent a lot of time talking about ancient history and medieval history with regard to missions that people haven't really dug into. But then there's also early modern and late modern missions history. There's so much for us to learn from. And I think we need to remember these things because, right, Scott, as the book of Hebrews says, we're a part of this great cloud of witnesses. We have to learn from all these great missionaries who've come before us, right? And so I'm excited to dive into our topic today. Hey, listeners, if you've been here for a while, you know our tagline already: helping goers think and thinkers go. Well, we really mean that. Let me ask you, what are you going to do with everything that you're listening to right now on this show? And could it be that the Lord is leading you to join His mission and extend His kingdom among the nations in a new way? Remember that God doesn't call the equipped. He equips the called. He gets the most glory by using normal, weak, doubting people. Maybe you're ready to say what the prophet Isaiah said, "Here I am, Lord, send me." If you think missions, whether that's short-term or long-term, is in your future, we are here to partner with you and your church in the process of sending you. Our team wants to talk to you here at ABWE. We're a family of ministries extending across more than 80 nations of the globe, engaged in evangelism, discipleship, and church planting. Our team wants to talk to you. Go to abwe.org/sendme. Again, abwe.org/sendme, all one word. No guilt trips, no high-pressure sales tactics, just a friendly voice here to pray with you as you and your church discern your calling. So start the conversation now. abwe.org/sendme.
Yeah, me too. And, I thought I knew a lot about the history of missions, especially in Asia and especially in China. And yet we're still so many new things to learn. And so we're really excited to welcome on a guest that we've only had in passing before when we were at Cedarville University, but someone that we were very familiar with him and his work and obviously his colleagues. And so we're glad to welcome Dr. Joshua Bowman. He's former missionary to Zambia and then also went to South Asia and ministered there. He's now an assistant professor of missions and theology at Cedarville University. And we're going to be talking about one of his favorite missionaries, but I don't want to spoil it. Josh, welcome to the show. We're glad to have you. Who is your favorite missionary and why should everyone fall in love with this person?
Yeah, thanks, guys. It's great to be back with you. And if I could spend maybe an afternoon, you get those questions one day with a former missionary, who would it be? And it would be John Nevius. Now, he was 1829 to 1893, so he's probably not the natural pick for many. And here's a couple things I appreciate about him. One, he lived during a really hard time and he prioritized evangelism and discipleship. And one of the things we'll get into today is he was a really gracious critic. There are so many things in missions and theology that we care about and that we're passionate about, and we are concerned that they're done right in a biblical way. And he looked at some things in his time and said, hey, this isn't going right. And he proposed something better. And if you read just some basic missions text, usually you just get his name, maybe a couple sentences in a paragraph. But I think we have a lot to learn from this man that has contemporary application for us today.
Well, tell us just in a few minutes, give us a brief sketch of what it is about him that stands out so much to you. What is his legacy? What is his story? Why is he one of, I think you said 3 missionaries whose photos are framed in your office?
That's right. I do have David Livingston. I was just reading last night. Maybe we have a conversation about him another time. But he was in the same area where I was a missionary during some of his journey around that area in Zambia. And then I've got William Carey. We are around his area in South Asia. But John Nevius is the man. He began as a young man, and his mom was really concerned. He's from New York and did not have a relationship with the Lord. And God deeply got a hold of his heart when he went down to the South in Georgia to be a teacher and met the Lord. And one of the things that he was characterized by the time he gets to be a missionary is he would go on these missionary itinerating journeys. And he would be 2 to 3 months in the interior of China, taking to the gospel to people and places that had never heard it before. And particularly, he raised a really important question about precedent. Like, when you start going as a missionary, as a foreigner, what are the traditions and things that you're laying down that are going to have such a big impact? One of the things he thought about as well is how do we raise up national leaders? And I think all of us would at least give voice to, that's the missionary task, to evangelism and discipleship and to start local churches and then eventually for leaders to be raised up. And he was really concerned. And this is how I kind of got interested. As I was in South Asia, I thought, how is what I'm doing kind of leading to the long-term health and growth of the church? Lots of us have those concerns. How does the church grow? And that's some of the reasons he began to get my attention, at least.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And even where he's fitting in the timeline of missions in China. So the first Protestant missionary to China was Robert Morrison. And so he would have been, and then Hudson Taylor didn't come till quite a bit later. So kind of how does he fit into that movement of missionaries to China even? The
great century of missions is basically 1800 to 1900. So right at the turn of the century, 1800, we have William Carey, and now we've got Nevius on the scene. And this is part of the push from the coastland to the inland. They're going to places where they've not been allowed before because of either treaties or because of just not safe for those things. So whether in Africa or Asia, so he's pushing on. The Shantung province is where he was and started pushing on. And one of the big questions surrounding there was how do you get results? That's a big question in missions today. How do we get results? And one of the things he noticed with missionaries there was, man, it takes time to learn the language. People who send you are wanting to see those results. And one of the things he really focused on was the voluntary activity of just normal believers and raising them up.
So, and I appreciate that so much because, missionaries and their early disciples, people who join those missionary teams, they're not superheroes. This is ordinary disciples making more ordinary disciples. That's a great emphasis. And that kind of leads to, this question. It is easy to be a critic. right? I mean, that's something we wrestle with on this show, right? It's easy to talk about other people that are doing work, right? But what are some of the solutions that he brought to the table as well in his era of the missions movement?
A couple of things that he saw that he didn't like is one was employing nationals. He saw because we want results and because nationals can often do it faster, there were many missionaries. What's funny is the mid 1800s, he's calling this the old method. Like this is what he writes about. The old method is for missionaries to go in, use money. And he ultimately said, like, it hurts the cause of the gospel because people are thinking, oh, you're becoming a Christian because of money. It hurts the people who are paid because it's hard to tell, like, hey, are they kind of like mercenaries who've been hired for this, or do they actually believe it? So there's a suspicion of the church. There's a suspicion of the gospel. There's a suspicion of converts when money was involved. And that's kind of where this term, and maybe didn't originate, but rice Christians. Like, you give me rice, you give me these things, I'll become a Christian. So one of the big things out of that, he was concerned that using money was setting a poor precedent and it was stopping the voluntary activity of normal Christians. If someone else is getting paid for this, then why should I do that? Or it may be really speedy in the beginning, but what's it going to go like to the long-term health in those things? So here's a couple of things that I think we can take away for even today that he said. And a big one was precedent. When you go into a place, like, what are the long-term impacts that your methods are going to have? And he said, in this case, like, money could actually do a lot of damage.
Scott, can I kick it to you real quick? I mean, these are things that you wrestled with. Starting a business in Asia and looking at who do we employ, how do we make sure that this business venture is a service to the people that are around us, not just, an excuse for an American to be in a certain country. What are some of the conclusions that you reached wrestling through those same things, at a different point, obviously, in our history?
Yeah, that's a good question. And let me just also kind of maybe expand that too. I know that some of our missionary friends still wrestle with this because there's that weird dynamic of tension of, well, I mean, we're getting paid to do ministry. And these are poor people that need support and need help too. Why don't we just pass that along? And yet I think the concerns that Nevius brought out and that Josh, you highlighted, are still the concerns of today of like, how do you, I remember being in, I'm not going to say the country because the missionaries might be listening, but like that there was a critique of one of the national partners because like he's just doing what he's doing because he's getting all this money. And that's what the other national leaders were all saying about this guy. And so it does create weird tension. I think for us, and this is maybe a little bit off of the theme here, but like with our business, we were trying to like say, okay, how can we provide real business services and then hire believers? So basically helping them to be kind of tent maker ministry, not paying them to do the ministry, but paying them to do important work that would also put them in positions of being able to do ministry. So hiring Chinese nationals who are believers and want to serve and be involved in the Great Commission to work alongside of interns that we were working with that were of Muslim background, as we were trying to find, ways that weren't undermining the church, the national church. We're working alongside of it without also not creating like a parallel missions, Western funded arm that we get to be the default bishops over. So anyway, I love it's interesting, even as you're talking about this, the idea, I'm looking ahead a little bit in the notes of one of the ideas that Nevius kind of helped articulate from scripture called the three selves. And I want you to describe that a little bit. But in China today, the national church is called the three self patriotic church or patriotic movement. And I'm assuming it kind of comes out of this work that Nevius did. And I just want to also just a little bit more background. It's interesting, Nevius working in Shandong province, there's two ways of writing the Chinese names in Romanized characters, but it would be said Shandong. And that's actually where Confucius is from. So it's actually kind of the heart of Chinese culture and civilization. It was also a place that was heavily colonized and was a source of tension there. But it's really interesting. He's thinking about probably looking at the work of Confucius and how embedded it was in the culture and going like, hey, how do we help Christianity to take root in this place in the same kind of a way? So why don't you explain a little bit of what he was trying to develop with that three self idea?
Part of it, this is the age of paternalism, colonialism. It's, hey, the gospel started in these places, but there comes a time when foreigners and the missionary can no longer act like mom and dad. So in many ways, that was not passing the baton, not allowing local men and women to take leadership and just responsibility. We might talk of it as like local ownership of like the church task or the missionary task. So really, this was a reaction of missionaries to outsiders who were continuing to hold on to influence. And like you often think of like teaching a child to maybe do a basic house chore. It seems like they're never quite ready and it's easier to do yourself. And you can imagine missionaries going and they're not quite ready to preach and to teach, or they're not quite ready to do this. So the three selves, one is self-governing. So the whole idea there is not to have outside influence. And that could be somebody from like the Pope or someone outside like that. But of course, like local influence as well, that the authority in the local church is with the congregation. So self-governing is the first one, that others aren't directing them, telling what to do and how to do it. And sometimes we look at this and like, well, that's the national's fault. And that's where I would say a lot of this duty is on the missionary to prepare and to kind of know when to leave and when to step aside and to partner. The other one is self-propagating. So first one, self-governing. Second one is self-propagating here, that they would know how and kind of take up the mantle of, it's our job and responsibility to reach our own people. And that's a big part of mission strategy. And the second one would be self-supporting. So not depending on money and finances and all those other things. So what he really wanted them to do is like, wherever people came to know Christ, like stay there. Don't expect to move to a mission station. Don't expect to be supported there, and like learn to be a leader in the training you need as much as possible, like in context. So the old model was like extract them out, train them up and employ them, and then send them out as like missionaries. Instead, he was like, no, I'm going to go travel to them. I'm going to equip them where they are. They're going to be tested, which is often kind of harder in your own context. And the last thing is he was like, everyone ought to be a teacher, like discipling someone, and everyone ought to be both a learner as well. So when money is involved, it often is like there's this professional class of people that are responsible for the missionary task. And he was like, no, let's actually equip everyone in a way that they're involved in sharing the gospel and making disciples.
That's super helpful how you're breaking that down. You know, it seems obvious to us today. Well, of course, a missionary is going to where the lost are and is winning them and then forming a church in that local context. But yeah, we can't take these things for granted at all. Now, there's been some work done on these, three self ideas, obviously in missiology since the days of Nevius, and some will add, and I think there's different versions of this. Some will add a fourth and even more, self-theologizing is one of these as well. I'm just curious. So just Josh Bowman's opinion, is there a point at which it goes too far where, are we so focused on these churches that are being formed and planted? Are we asking them to reinvent the wheel, or are we asking them to be too mature too soon sometimes? And what's your read on that, kind of catapulting us out of the days of Nevius and looking at today? Has that gone maybe too far in some areas, or there's ways that we need to correct? What's your read on how that conversation has developed?
Part of it is, remember, the three selves were a reaction against paternalism and colonialism and an overreach and an overstay of the missionaries. So if we in 2024 think, okay, if a church is doing these three selves, then those are the markers or the main markers of a healthy church. If that's all we have, let's just admit, in the history of the church and biblically and theologically, that's not the main point. We've had the four marks of the church. The Reformation added two more kind of markers to those. There's other ways of thinking about church health. And I would think today as well, like partnership is really, really important. Like how we interact with the churches immediately around us, or maybe within a country, or even cross-culturally. So the point is not like isolation. No one else can speak to me, no more influence. So that's a kind of a reaction. So there's a danger of paternalism there. But I would say if there's a new way of looking at paternalism today or controlling churches, it is with finances. And I think that's why this is a relevant discussion. So I don't know if it's a real term, but maybe I could say neo-paternalism. A new way of going about paternalism that's not me controlling the church, but my funds and who I support and kind of what that looks like. So there are things even today that we can do with our funds that might help or actually hurt a church.
So you've written on this, and you've learned a lot from the life of Nevius about this particular topic. What would you like us to learn as we from the example and the teaching of Nevius about how do we deal with money in these issues of, hey, we've got a lot, they have a little, they need help, we have the ability to help. How do we help without, to use the phrase we've talked about in the show, how do we help without hurting?
I think I'd go back to Nevius for two things. One is he took a big time out from a lot of his evangelistic tours because there was a huge famine, and he raised a whole lot of money, and he gave a whole lot of money away just to support people who are really, really hurting. So there's times of humanitarian crisis that it is good and right and godly to use that. Another thing that he did is these men and some women as well would come for some type of theological training, basically around the seasons of agriculture, and they would stay in his home. While they were at his home, he would feed them and train them and pay for a lot of those financial supports. So what were some principles here? One is the ongoing support of a local church and a pastor, and especially in a local church context. It seemed to be a principle with him, and I would say it's a good principle today that local church should be able to function on their own. I would say in the areas of training specifically, theological education, helping people maybe get books and resources and those things, that would be a good area. One, because it doesn't create dependency. The church can go on whether you're there or not. And as far as the education, those are things that are appreciated and I think can really, really help. But if they're not available, the church doesn't fall. And that's the primary agent of God's mission and his plan for the nations.
What are some things that you would say, looking back on this legacy of Nevius, that, and you've already touched on some of this, but you've learned obviously from the best. What are some things that we would do differently today?
I'll give you three things. One, I'd say he was a gracious critic. And I would think maybe something that we need to learn, I need to learn and to remember is even with those I disagree with about methodology, there are many brothers in Christ who I would not have a preference in the way that they're going about the task, but not to raise it to a level of that I treat them like an unbeliever, that I couldn't worship around the throne with them. So I think that's a really, really big one. Another one is just the importance of learning the local language. I think he was really big on that. And then he also had a big impact on Korea. Maybe that's something that we could talk about as well, and kind of his ongoing impact, because where he was, I mean, he had a big influence, but also he put these things into place for maybe about 10 years. So it was limited kind of in its scope and in its reach because of his early death. He was about 64 years old. And some of these things that were put into place better in Korea had a lasting impact.
Yeah. So explain that. How did he get connected to Korea?
Yeah, so a couple of years before his death, he died in 1893. In 1890, some missionaries in Korea heard about some of his methods. He had been writing in basically this journal, so this book came about. And they invited him to come down, and he did. And he shared some of his methods about money, about teaching. He had written a whole lot. So as he goes down there, they adopt some of his methods. Part of it is because they didn't have the finances or the personnel. And they really liked his focus on the text and teaching and training up nationals. And the Presbyterians, he was a Presbyterian, by the way, the Presbyterians wholeheartedly endorsed it. So new missionaries who came, I thought this was pretty interesting. They had to pass their language test in Korean, and they had to pass basically like a final exam on his book, The Planting and Development of Churches. And if you think about like other countries outside of the West who are sending missionaries, the two probably that you think of are South Korea and Brazil. And you think about the growth of the church there, the percentage of Christians that are there. And if you have been anywhere around the world in missions, you've probably met a South Korean missionary. I'm not saying all that's due to, I want to be careful there with John Nevius, but there was an influence and a blessing of God. And part of it was, yes, that it's a normal expectation. Every believer is part of this missionary task. Everybody's learning from somebody. Everybody's teaching someone else. So where it was for the longest kind of wholeheartedly implemented this type of methodology is where we see and impact even today, however many years later we are, around 150 years.
On my understanding of some of the history of the growth of the Christian movement in Korea is that a lot of that does come from Presbyterian influence, and a lot of it has to do with their willingness to minister to the whole family. Of course, Presbyterians, we're Baptists, we're going to have some disagreements on the role of children automatically, not automatically in the new covenant and things like that. But there is something to be said for seeing the church as comprised not just of isolated individuals, but families and social networks and communities that have to be brought together and seen through the lens of God's covenantal dealings with his people. And in the same way, too, the fact that Nevius is locating church planting, not just isolated evangelism of individuals, but church planting at the center of the missionary task, that's its staying power, right? Is that you're not just creating converts, you're creating these cohesive communities of local churches. I think that's something that we also need to learn from today, too. Do you care to comment on that at all, Josh?
No, that's really good. I think there's so much focus today in missions on humanitarian and meeting physical needs and all those things. And again, we saw a good model of that in Nevius, but at the heart of it, if China was going to and is going to be reached, Nevius knew it was going to be through the voluntary activities and godly lives of just normal members, and kind of voluntary, like it's normal. Every believer involved and a fruit-bearing disciple in the local church. So normal Christians doing normal Christian things that aren't stopped by money, that aren't controlled by nationals, but are freed up to walk in the Spirit, to have the Word of God, to teach the Word of God and say, hey, this isn't a professional's job. This isn't a foreigner's job. This is, in fact, my job, and I have the Holy Spirit, and I can do it. And basically, in many ways, to get out of the way and let the church be the church, and to hand that over into nationals' hands, and to no longer kind of stand in the way.
You had mentioned, that he had some area there that he had a significant influence. Can you just talk a little bit about what was that in the area where he was implementing these things? And I think I got my timeline wrong earlier. I think you said he's from 1829 to 1893, but that wasn't the course of his ministry. He was born in 1829. So he's coming. So he is
a Presbyterian. So he was already in the covenant from the time of birth.
Yeah. But he is a contemporary. He is a contemporary of Hudson Taylor, right? But explain, what is the fruit of what he did, and how do you see that this turned out for him, and it wasn't just a theory, right? It actually became his practice, and maybe you can help us understand what was the outcome of it.
Yeah, there was lots of dialogue, and one thing he did well is he wrote for the missionary community. So there were these missiological journals or kind of news of ways it got out that led to discussions. There was an 1890 meeting in China of these missionaries that I think was pretty important. There was a 1900 World Missionary Conference in New York. A lot of people don't know about. And they were discussing his ideas, and people were talking about, okay, how do we do this? Because people were giving lip service to, okay, we need to hand over control. But there was more lip service than there was actually doing that and doing that well, until you get to 1910. Missiologists and people in our world would know, the big conference at Edinburgh. So in many ways, just the whole idea of partnership, the whole idea of walking with nationals as brothers and sisters instead of parents. And a guy named Roland Allen, who missiologists would know as well, would come later in the 60s, and he would kind of pick up the mantle of this conversation. And we're still having conversations today about how can we make sure that we partner well with churches, not to abandon them, not to control them. But I think we're in the era of what's the church in whatever context you're thinking, and how can we as outsiders come alongside them in this missionary task?
I've said it on the show before too, but it bears repeating. You gave a term to something that we've talked about, but haven't used the label. Neo-paternalism sounds so weird to say, but just that idea of, okay, we're not going to fall into the excesses of creating dependency or seeing ourselves as superior believers somehow. But we want to do more than just touch and go ministry. We want to do more than leave you to your own devices. We want to partner with you in the gospel. We want to love you. The Apostle Paul says, you have many teachers, but few fathers. We want to be fathers in that good and biblical sense of nurturing and loving and caring for those who are entrusted to our ministry. Frankly, it's a lesson that anyone can employ in ministry, not just a missionary on the field, but a pastor with their flock. Does your heart beat for the flock, the people that are under your care? And so I think there's so much that we can learn from the life of Nevius, but also there's a lot that we can learn from the life of Bowman. And so before we wrap it up, Josh, can you share with us, how can people follow you, get more from you, anything you're doing with Cedarville or even outside of that as well? This is your chance.
I would say Cedarville University is the biggest one, but maybe I'll tell you an exciting project that's coming up. A book's coming out called Before You Go. I wrote that with my other professor here at Cedarville, Matt Bennett, and it's for anywhere from college students to maybe seminary, or you're like a year from deploying, like practical conversations with 10 of our friends of like a coffee conversation, like leaving what you love. Evangelism on the field, prayer, being a husband, being a father, partnering well as a team and thinking through these. So it's not a deeply theological in that sense, but just a good conversation on, hey, before I go to the field. The women's version is already out that our wives got the idea first. And I walked into Matt's office and I said, why haven't we thought of writing the guys version? So both of them, the girls are available now. The men's will be coming out here in June. So love for your listeners to get hold of that.
Yeah. This is Matt. Who are you talking about? Matt?
Yeah, don't know him.
That's right.
Yeah, we don't know that guy. But
some goofball. However, we have had Emily Bennett on, of course, as you mentioned, to talk about the ladies' version of Before You Go. If you haven't yet listened to that episode from a few months ago, go ahead and go to missionspodcast.com and search for that. Search for Emily Bennett or search for Before You Go. Some excellent practical insights, and excited for the guys' version of that to come as well. A little derivative. We're hoping that your next writing project is a little more original, Josh, but that's okay. And we appreciate the effort. Anyway,
we're just riding your coattails. Who can blame us?
That's right. As all good men do with their godly wives, right? And of course, when it releases, Josh, remember to come back on the show and let's talk about it more. And let's give our listeners an early glimpse of that. Does that sound good?
Sounds great. Thanks.
Well, absolutely. And we're so glad you joined us today. And if you are watching, listening, however you're getting the show, we're so glad you joined us today as well. The Missions Podcast is a ministry of ABWE. To learn more about ABWE and maybe take your next steps in the Great Commission, go to abwe.org. Of course, to get more of this show, go to missionspodcast.com. You can hit the support tab up at the top. We appreciate all of you who support the show through ABWE and just straight through the show link as well. Of course, the best way you can support the show is not only with a gift of any amount, but is also by subscribing, leaving a positive rating and review, and sharing with a friend. Those sorts of things favor us in the algorithms, allowing more people to discover this content and to be mobilized. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future guests or topics, email alex@missionspodcast.com or scott@missionspodcast.com. We would love to hear from you. And until next week's conversation about missions, theology, and practice, go make disciples of all nations. And we'll see you then. Take care.